it's finally reassembly time. So we're going to start by first reassembling the throttle plate or the base plate, and I've already stuck the shafts in. They just slide in from the side. No big trick there. And we're going to put the throttle blades in, as we talked about earlier. These are going to go with the imprinted 180 down towards the center and in a downward orientation. So I'm going to put a couple screws in to start with, but before everything is completely locked down, I will use Loctite or a thread locking solution, because we're no longer using the soft brass screws that have or are able to be squished into place on the end to keep them from coming back out. So the trick here is to get these centered so that they close completely and you can get everything tightened down nicely. So just a quick test, and yep, they close completely, seal off nicely, and if you have to, you can hold it up to the light and make sure that just a minimum, if no light, comes through the edges of the throttle blades. And we're going to do the same thing to the back. Closes up and seals nicely. I'm going to take them back out one at a time and use some red high strength thread locker to ensure these things don't back out on us. This situation, I like the gel the best, but the liquid works just as fine, just as well. Personal preference. And since these are stainless steel and not brass, I can actually put them in and give them just a little tighter crank down than I would normally with a brass screw, because I don't have to worry about these breaking as easily. You can break them, of course, but with a 1/4 inch ratchet and not over torquing them, tighten them down with the thread locker, and you've pretty much guaranteed that these things are going to stay in place for as long as you want them to. So, part 1 of reassembly, throttle plates and throttle shafts back in the base plate, and we'll be back in a second to continue on. Now that we're done with the base plate assembly, let's move on over to the bowls and get these things put together. So, let's go ahead and start with the primary, and easy to tell. The primary bowl has got the threaded inlet and the sight hole on, I guess that would be the left front if you were looking, or left side if you were looking from the front. So, first thing we're going to do is drop in the needle and seat. And there's little screws in the hole. And before you put those in, make sure that the shaft is not come out, the spring hasn't flown out and gone somewhere. And if it has, refer to your pictures from disassembly to see the correct way of putting it back together. Or if hopefully you have the other one is still in good shape, you can do it. Use that as a template. So let's go ahead and just put in a brand new sight plug and new gasket with it. Again, we're going to use the big screwdriver we can get to fit in there to keep from ruining the brass. Go ahead and flip it over, and this is the primary, so it's going to use the 30cc squirter. Excuse me, I forgot to grab the springs. And we need to put the spring, and well, I guess I'm going to have to take a break here and forgot to dig out the screws. Hang on and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So, we'll put these covers on. And now that we've got the correct screw, we'll get them all put together. And obviously the pump arm goes to the outside. And just a little tightening. One last thing we're going to do is we are going to change the O-ring on the needle and seat. So if we take a look, the typical needle and seat, let's go ahead and get rid of this screw and nut. Going to replace those with new, better looking ones. But what I found over the years is I've seen a lot of guys replace the needle and seat because it was leaking, and only to realize that it isn't really the needle seat that's the problem, it's the O-ring. These O-rings tend to shrink over the years. What happens is they stay wet all the time with fuel when they're in use, and if your car sits around for a while, what will happen is it shrinks down and it will not seal off inside the needle and seat hole there. The fuel will come right up, go right into the carburetor, and it'll actually overfill it. And then that tends to come out of the vent hole or through the boosters and just pours fuel all over the place and creates quite a mess. So what I'm going to do the easy way is take my X-Acto and cut. And this is actually kind of a brittle O-ring, so it's good for replacing it. And we'll just roll the new one on. It would be a lot easier if I wasn't wearing gloves, but you may have noticed throughout the series I've had different colored gloves on. Each of the different colors is actually a different thickness, and just from experience I found that certain procedures tend to rip gloves quicker than others, so I'll put on a thicker glove when I'm doing certain things just to ensure that I don't have to replace them over and over. So it's really easy to just we'll put the nut on. I'm going to replace these with these little plastic or nylon washers. And I'm going to put the screw on the top of the washer there. And we can just drop on the bottom washer. Introduce the jet in. And there we go. As a primary adjustment, I found that if you, let's loosen the screw up a little bit there. If you twist it in, the needle and seat in, until you can get the float to rise up where it is approximately halfway between the solder seam and the top, level with the sight hole plug. That's going to be a pretty good starting point when you put the carburetor back together, and it won't overflow, but there'll be enough fuel in the bowl to actually start the car. And that's it. We have got the primary float bowl back together. We're going to now do the same thing with the secondary. Talking and doing a video at the same time. So now we have the secondary. I'm just going to take and put the inlets in about halfway, just to remind me that I need to tighten them. I'm also going to use some nylon washers for these. I've had better luck with them than the paper ones over the years, so there's the secondary. I wish I had a cameraman so I could stand in different angles and make him move around. Trying to lean over and get this done makes some of the things a little harder to do. But that's all there is to getting the bowls back together. They're very simple. And once it's all completely assembled and on the little engine, on the carburetor stand, we will make sure we go back and give everything a good tightening so there's no leaks when we get it on the engine in a running situation. I'll be back and we will get on to the next part, which should be the center section. That's quick and easy because we're not going to put the choke mechanism back on. This is, like I said earlier, a dyno carburetor. Doesn't really need it. And then we'll just drop it on the center section and put all the different pieces together, and we should be done on the next clip. Be right back. Okay, so we are back with the center section. First thing we're going to do is return these two check valves where they belong. Again, we mentioned while we took them out that pointy end goes down. Just drop them in the little bore, and they just go right in here and here for the primary and secondary accelerator pumps, squirters, whatever you want to call it. Then we're going to take, now I forgot to mention when we took these out that the squirters have a number embossed on the side of them. This one's a 31, the primary is also a 31, but sometimes they're split to different sizes, so you always want to check before you take them off to make sure you've got the right size in the right end. We're going to take our screw and take a couple of new washers They're both flat washers, so they're going to go on the screw. Put one on. Put the screw in squirter. Put another washer on the back. And we're going to drop this in where the squirter is pointing down into the bores, or the venturis. Now, the squirter has kind of a little indentation in the back here. That's where it goes against the front or back wall. There's a little tab that keeps it from rotating. And then the two squirter holes point down into the venturis. Also make sure that the old washer is not on the screw. They like to stick after years of being there, especially the one that's got to conform to the bevel. And I had to take these off with an X-Acto to get them scraped off. But we're going to put that back together. Grab our handy number 3 Phillips screwdriver. Give them a little twist down. And that is all we need to do with the center section. Since this is a dyno carburetor, we are not going to put the choke back on. That, in a dyno situation, can create more problems than it solves. So that doesn't need to be put back on. Let's grab the center section. And let's put this thing together. So one thing to notice, I want to mention, is the old gasket that came off was actually the wrong gasket for this carburetor. Now in the smaller 750 to down to, I believe, 600s, you'll notice that these two holes down here are for the idle circuit and the transition slot idle. And on the smaller carburetors, this bore is smaller, or the diameter here is smaller, and they're able to put these holes at an angle. On the 850, they can't do that because of the larger bore. They want to make sure there's enough gasket around those holes, so they're put side by side instead of at the angle. So since this is an 850, the base plate and the center section have to be lined up, so these holes, well, the rear doesn't have the idle circuit, but you want to make sure that at least the primaries have the holes uncovered, so not only does it idle correctly, but you also want to make sure that the transition slot gets the fuel it needs, so when the car comes off of idle and is going on to the main circuits, there's just a little extra flow to ensure there's no stumbling. At this point, we're just going to drop the center section on. And I'll get my little hat, also known as a Folgers 2-pound coffee can. Wish I could find those again. Those are perfect for doing that. Oops. Oh well. I guess we have to put these bottom on one more time. And I gotta make sure the gasket stays up. Okay. Everything's clear down the throttle bores. So I can drop in the 6 screws. The older carburetors actually had 8. There were 2 screws, and I'll show you in a second, that are not used on a lot of the newer carburetors or aftermarket center sections. So people just tend to put them together at some point with just the 6. It seems to work just fine, so I'm not going to complain. Let me tighten these down just a little bit, and then I'll show you where the other... I guess if I use a Phillips instead of a slot, I could get it done easier. So here are the 6 screws I just put in across the front and across the back. 2 middle ones don't really seem to need them, so we're not going to put them on. And let's put the bottom plate back on one more time. Flip it over. This time it won't come apart. Coffee can off. And let's go ahead and grab and modify the primary metering block. There's a couple of things we didn't do on this. So the idle screws, idle adjustment screws, just a little cork washer in there to keep it from backing out or going in or whatever. So I like to replace those whenever I rebuild a carburetor, just so you know that these screws aren't going to back off on you. They're cheap, well worth the extra couple pennies for these things. And push them in the hole. Small screwdriver. Oops. Get a smaller screwdriver. Sorry about that. And we'll just screw this in. Now, if the carburetor, the engine, and everything is running correctly, a good starting point is about 3/4 out on your idle adjustment screws. And that is usually good enough to start with. If not, you'll know once the car's running and it's a quick, easy adjustment, but I found that 3/4 will be enough to get you started. Not an exact measurement, but it's pretty close. So at this point, let's go ahead and put the rest of it together. So I'm going to drop a new gasket on the bowl side of the metering block. And before I go further, what I do want to check is to ensure the metering block, or I'm sorry, the power valve in the metering block is tight. I noticed one of them seemed to be a little loose, and this can create lots of tuning problems if you don't get it right. So 1 inch, and that thing is like really finger loose, so I'm sure that was causing some problems in itself. Huh. Well, there we go. Interesting, a little tight. And we've got 2 little tangs on the base plate, or the metering block to center the gasket on. We'll take the primary bowl, drop it together with that, lift the arm for the accelerator pump, get a new screw and a new washer, put those together, get a new screw and a new washer, don't drop it this time, and get it together. The reason I'm putting new washers on is that these are reusable washers, although over time they tend to kind of squish down. The more you tighten the bowl, the more they squish. And at some point in time I've actually seen where you get to the point where the metal edge of the screw will actually touch the bowl before it squishes the gasket any longer, and you end up with a dreaded fuel bowl leak. So cents worth of gaskets. I know I keep saying a few cents here and a few cents there, and it's adds up to a few dollars, but at the end of the day, I think it's well worth it to spend a few extra dollars just to make sure that you do this once, put it back on the car, and go have fun. This is a fun little tool I got from Jegs. They had it really inexpensive on sale one time, but it's a nice solid piece, knurled handles on it. One end puts the screws on, the other end puts the jets in. So you have a 2-in-1 tool, works really nice. Okay, just had to grab the escaped gasket. And let's turn this around. And we are coming down to the wire on this thing. Let's really quickly, well, we've got it at this point. I grabbed the gaskets for the inlets. And put those in place so that we know. Again, they're still loose, and that'll remind me that I need to tighten them when I get it on a really stable surface, i.e. the engine. That way I can really torque on it and I don't have to worry about the carburetor flipping and falling off. So I think at this point we are looking at a pretty nice looking carburetor from what we started with. What I'm going to do at this point is grab the last few pieces of linkage, go through the parts bin to make sure that I haven't forgotten to put anything on. I'll come back and we will do the final wrap-up of the last few pieces to finish our series on rebuilding and powder coating a Holley carburetor. I went through the parts bin and it looks like I've got most everything in except for the accelerator pump cams and the primary to secondary linkage. So that means we are just moments away from finishing this off. When I took the cam off front and back, I put the screw right back into the hole that it came out of, and I noticed, or took note, that position 1 on the arms is where they were both screwed into. There's also position 2, and what it does is it sets the aggressiveness of how soon or how quickly the pump cam starts to work on as you press down on the throttle, basically. I don't think I've ever had a pump cam that was quite as stubborn as this one. Of course, I'm on camera, so it makes sense that it's going to be a pain. And as long as we're on this side, let's go ahead and put the primary to secondary linkage back in. Just slides in there. I've got a new washer and a new little linch pin to go in from the back. I guess I could have used the old stuff, but why not use the new stuff if you got it handy? Of course, if this goes flying, I'll be back to the old stuff again. Drop it in. Got it right the first time. So, just for the excitement level, this is the last piece going into this carburetor, and we can officially call it done. I'll do the accelerator pump adjustments, which is just this nut, to make sure we've got everything set up the way we need it. But we can get that at the dyno shop or anytime we want. Not a big deal. And there we go. This is the way they normally go in. Simply. And that is it, folks. We are done.